Hi, chess friends, and welcome back. Today I'm going to be going through the fourth exercise, part of GM Jacob Aagaard's book, Excelling at Positional Chess. And today we have a really cool position from a game played in Lugano, Switzerland, 1989, between the first English Grandmaster, Tony Miles, and the Soviet chess legend himself, Viktor Korchnoi, also known as Viktor the Terrible. And I hope by the end of understanding this position, you'll understand why he got that name. This position is black to move. And as always, take 10 to 15 minutes to really understand and analyze the position. And once you think you have the solution, just click play and we'll get started. All right, I take it you've spent some time to understand, think about the position. So let's get started with the analysis. As always, the first thing that I like to do is understand the material imbalance. So here we see that black has 7 pawns, white has 7 pawns, white has the 2 bishops, black has the bishop and the knight. White has 2 rooks, black has 2 rooks, both sides have a queen and both sides have kings. So while the material count is even, it's important to note that white has the bishop pair, black does not. Once we've gotten that established, the next thing we can look at is starting to understand the pieces themselves. What are their individual contributions to the position? So let's start here with the black side. Let's look at this knight on f6. So knight on f6 is applying direct pressure on the pawn on e4, which is also defended by the queen on d3. And the black queen on c2 is applying some indirect pressure to the pawn as well. So it's interesting to note here that black has 2 attackers, the queen and the knight, while white only has 1 defender, the queen on d3, supporting this pawn on e4. So the question I'm asking myself already is this pawn undefended? Is it ripe for the taking? Moving on, we see that we have a black bishop on d6, and right off the bat, I just think this is not a good piece in this position as it stands. And that's for 2 reasons. One, it's quite passive in defending the pawn on e5, which is being attacked by the bishop on b2. And 2, it's also playing a passive role as a blockader of this protected passed pawn on d5. As a general rule of thumb, you really want knights to play those blockaders instead of bishops. So perhaps this knight might be better accustomed to the square on d6 than this bishop. The queen on c2 is, of course, applying pressure on the queen on d3 and applying indirect pressure on the pawn on e4. As for black's rook on c8, I really like it here. It's applying pressure along the c file, and it's also covering the queen on c2. The rook on f8 here, on the other hand, can be better, but we're not really so sure which square it's going to be better on. Does it want to be actively involved along the c file? Maybe. Or does it want to sit where it is so it can help prepare possible f7 to f5 advance, trying to break down white center? Now, looking for the white pieces, of course, the queen on d3 is attacking the queen on c2, protecting the pawn on e4. But I think the interesting part about this position is really looking at the bishops here. White's bishop on e2 is very limited in scope. In fact, right now, it's just defending the queen on d3. You can also tell that the white bishop is limited in scope by looking at the pawn structure. Pawns on e4, d5, b5, and soon to be a4 to cement the pawn on b5 tell you that they're all blocking diagonals for the white bishop to continue. The white bishop on b2, however, is a monster. I mean, just look at this guy terrorize the pawn on e5 and render black's bishop on d6 very passive. And if we look at white's rooks, right at the moment, they're also sitting quite passive. This rook on a1 is defending the pawn on a3, but I think white's rooks want to get active on the c file, potentially with rook to c1. All right, so just from this sort of analysis, I think we can make some key observations about the position. One, white has a very strong center in the form of pawns on e4 and d5, and a protected pass pawn on d5. 2, white's bishop on b2 is a nuisance. attacking the pawn on e5, rendering the bishop on d6 very inactive. And 3, the black rook is exerting pressure along the c-file, potentially might want to get onto the c2 square itself. And 4, we're left with the unanswered question, is the pawn on e4 really undefended? Is it right for the taking? So with these 4 observations, I think we should start by answering that unanswered question, and that leads to calculation, which we must do clearly and thoroughly. So let's begin. If we play knight takes e4 in this position, white would of course play queen takes c2, black would respond with rook takes c2, and white has a very nice answer in this position, bishop to d3, attacking both the rook as well as the knight on e4. And so at first glance, I thought, well, this is probably not good for black. If I move the rook away, the knight on e4 is going to fall. If I move the knight, then the rook falls. But we need to remind ourselves about the critical observations we made. That's why those observations are so important. 1, the bishop on b2 is a nuisance. If it's a nuisance, why don't we just get rid of it? And so that leads to the question, well, what happens if I play rook takes b2? Well, if rook takes b2, white's going to play rook takes b2, and black can simply continue with knight to c5, attacking the bishop on d3. And what were some of our other observations? Well, white had a nearly impenetrable center, but knight takes e4 just destroyed that center, leaving the pawn on d5 undefended. So the question you're probably asking yourselves now is, well, is this exchange sacrifice justified? Well, let's just take a look at the position. The white bishop on d3, as we had mentioned before, was white's passive bishop, and it's still quite passive. Pawns on d5, pawn on b5, as well as soon to be pawn on a4 are not really helping it. It has limited scope and it doesn't have any real targets. The rooks on b2 and the rooks on a1 are very inactive at the moment, and they're struggling to get active because they don't have many open files. That's why black playing knight to c5 is such an important move. It just blockades this c file. And apart from that, black, I would say, has good reason to continue with this exchange sacrifice. And it turns out this is actually what Korchnoi played in the game. So let's see what happens. After knight to c5, white plays bishop to c2. But after bishop to c2, black just simply plays a simple developing move with rook to c8, just looking to get this rook active along the c file, maybe start to attack targets like d5, b5, who knows, right? Nothing too crazy. It's also important to note that if black didn't play rook to c8, they could have also played something like f5. But I would caution against playing a move like f5 because remember, you don't want to create unnecessary weaknesses. Here, white may have ideas such as f3, followed by playing g4, which is actually going to attack black's f5 pawns and try to revitalize this bishop along this long diagonal, something we really don't want. So I like black's idea of playing rook to c8 instead and just simply defending activating one of the only pieces that wasn't doing anything in this endgame. Moving on in the game, Tony Miles responded with rook to e1, so attacking the pawn on e5. Black plays knight to d7, doubling up the defense of the pawn on e5, as well as opening up this rook to be activated along the c file. White plays pawn on a4, solidifying b5 pawn, and black plays king to f8. Black's moves are very simple. All they're doing is getting their pieces to better positions, optimizing their activity, trying to get them involved in the endgame. White plays g3 with similar ideas with king to g2. And here black plays f5. And it's important to note, well, why is f5 good here and not before? The answer is that black's pieces are far better developed and coordinated in this position as they were before, with the king and the rook now more active. If white does continue with that idea of f3, g4, which is similar to what happens in the game, white does play f3, black can simply play king to f7, and if white plays g4, not king g2, g4, Then black can play king to f6, simply defending the pawn on f5. And it's going to be very difficult for this white bishop to break open this diagonal. Going back, what actually happened in the game was king to g2. But after king to g2, black simply plays rook to c4. And I mean, just look at the activity of this rook on c4. It is doing a great job controlling this entire flank. The pawn on a4 is now a tremendous weakness. Of course, after this, white plays rook to a2, trying to defend the pawn on a4. The bishop, the rook, all tied down to the defense of the a4 pawn, whereas this rook is having a great time just hanging out on the c4 square, putting pressure on these key squares. Moving forward, black continues to apply more pressure, knight to f6, attacking the weak d5 pawn. You're starting to understand why it was so important for black to break down the center. d5 pawn is a huge weakness. f5, e5, black has solidified his own center. White is again forced to retreat and back to the defense with rook to d1, and black plays a simple move, king to e7, trying to get the king more into the action. I think it's safe to say here that black has definitely a favorable position, even though he's down the exchange sacrifice, because you can see that black's rook is tremendously active. White's rooks are just defending. So is white's bishop. d5 pawn is a clear weakness. And practically speaking, black just has easier play, right? Black wants to play something like c5, followed by rook to d4 or bishop to d4, with ideas of blocking this rook from defending the d5 square so that the king can sort of march to d6 and take the d5 pawn. After the d5 pawn has been won, black has an easy passed pawn with ideas of e5, e4. And it's no wonder that with these ideas at hand, Korchnoi went on to win the game. Now, if you enjoyed that, please do like, share, and subscribe. I really, really appreciate that. And please stay tuned for our next exercise.